Stormhaven Lore, Part 2. Sacred Rites of the Stone Chewers by Nellie Sterone. For several seasons, I've been observing the Stone Chewers goblin tribe, recording their daily activities and becoming familiar with their customs and routines. Over time, I've deliberately crept closer and closer to the limits of their tribal camp, occasionally showing myself so briefly to the subjects would become used to my proximity. At one point, a warrior, out to relieve himself behind a tree, stumbled upon my observation post, and when he grunted and drew his crude but serviceable short sword, I thought my work had come to an untimely end. Luckily, the tribal shaman was nearby, and he intervened on my behalf, speaking harshly to the warrior and knocking aside his sword. The shaman pointed at me and slowly rotated his hand near his head, which I assume is a goblin gesture denoting acknowledgement of superior intellect. Who would have expected these so-called primitives to have such regard for scholarship? After that, there were no more incidents of hostility, and the goblins tolerated my presence so long as I kept a respectful distance from their females and offspring. Occasionally, a warrior would bark at me, but I simply replied by making the hand-rotating intelligence gesture next to my head, and the warrior would shrug and go back to his business. As so little is known about the religious practices of the goblin race, I decided to make the shaman of the tribe my particular study. The symbol of his office was a bone rod, and presumably a femur, with a small skull affixed to the end, possibly an infant's. This skull was ornamented with an assortment of feathers, spines, and animal claws, and filled with something like nut hulls, for it rattled loudly when shaken. The shaman would shake this holy symbol forcefully when summoning his congregation to sacred rituals, or when the females were not bringing him food or drink rapidly enough. At particular important rituals, the shaman would touch the symbol to his head and heart, and then point it to the sky and call out, "Moloch." At first I found this confusing, giving the similarity of Moloch to the goblin words mulk, which they use when chastising their durzogs or children, or mulk, the term for fecal matter. But gradually I learned to differentiate, and one day I realized that by crying Moloch, the shaman must be invoking the gods of the goblins. And then it struck me, Moloch is not really much different from Moloch. Could the god of the goblins and the god of the orcs be the one and the same? This kind of discovery could win my tenure at the College of Wayrest. I must get independent confirmation of this revelation. But how? The Bretons, Mongrels or Paragons, by Phrastus of Ellenhere. That men and mer can interbreed has long been known since the first humans began arriving on the shores of Tamriel in the middle of the Mythic era. However, broad intermingling of elves and humans only occurred in the far northwest of the continent, giving rise to the race of men known as the Bretons. Given the history of conflict between humans and the children of Waldmaris elsewhere in Tamriel, how and why did this intermingling occur in High Rock? The answer lies in the peculiar, for elves, culture of Clan Doreni, the once dominant mer of the northwest Tamriel. In contrast to the Aliads of Cyrodiil, who brutally enslaved any humans that came into contact with, the Doreni simply conquered the local needs, and then ruled them as a caste of nobility. The aristocratic elves established a system of feudal vassalage over their human subjects, with rights and privileges that included the prerequisite of coition with any human they desired. Sex with attractive needs was considered casual recreation, and Doreni nobles competed to have stables of the most desirable human subjects. The inevitable half-elven offspring from these liaisons were not adopted into the families of their Doreni parents, being considered a submer, but were nevertheless often given privileged positions among the subject needs. Over time, this led to the establishment of a recognized caste of mixed-blood humans who were given the name Bretons, from the Ellenfex Beratu, or half. The Breton caste was only allowed to marry humans, so over time their elven blood became more diluted, and the Nedic appearance predominated. Though they wielded great power for a time in the First Era, even then the clans of Elven Durrani were never numerous, and as their geographical hegemony expanded, administration and rulership were increasingly handed off to the Breton caste. After defeating the invading Alessian horde in First Era 482, Clan Durrani was scattered and effectively exhausted. As the elves retreated to the central High Rock, then finally Balthira Isle, the Bretons stepped easily into the shoes, assuming the feudal hierarchy established by the Durrani, and simply replacing them with their own noble families. The Breton nobles, who had been forced to differentiate themselves from the Durrani, part of their heritage, justified their new ascension by distancing themselves from elves and everything elven, ironically so, as the elven blood ran strongest in the older noble families. The Durrani were increasingly vilified by their former vassals, and the island clan became ever more insular and isolationist. However, they were still known as powerful magicians, and they were strong enough to repel the attempted Red Guard invasion in First Era 907. The Bretons continued refining themselves, inventing a myth of history of noble resistance to Durrani rule, and developing a thriving merchant class that began trading around the coasts of Tamriel. By the time the Empress Hestra and her legions arrived at Bankarai Pass in First Era 1029, they were ready to join the Empire of Men and embrace the Eight Divines. Under the Remans, High Rock was possibly the most stable and prosperous province in the Second Empire. Which brings us back to the deliberately provocative question of our title: are the Bretons then mongrels or paragons? The answer, of course, is both. Though if you call a Breton a mongrel, he is liable to feed you an inch or two of steel. The passionate race of the Bretons embodies the strengths of both men and mer, as well as their flaws. The Knightly Orders of High Rock, by Lady Cinnabar of Tanith. The Breton passion for feudal hierarchy pervades every aspect of High Rock society, from the lowliest peasant farmers to the High King in Wayrest. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the curious phenomenon of the Breton Knightly Orders. Here in Hammerfell, we Redguards sensibly award equal citizenship to every man or woman who knows which end of the sword to grasp. Oh, we have our governing class, of course, as civilization must be ordered and maintained, but below that level there are few distinctions. Not so in High Rock, where everyone is aware of their degree of nobility, which is invariably traced back to those Breton families who led the region's liberation from the overlordship of the Durrani elves. High Rock cultural history is founded on the tales of the noble and chivalrous Breton knights who were flung off the yoke of those elven masters. After these knights drove the Durrani back into Balthira Island, they founded the Knightly Orders to carry on the tradition of nobles in arms and to ensure that High Rock would have able and ready defenders in times of trouble. So the stories go, at least. Today, every petty kingdom and duchy in High Rock has its own knightly order, with traditions that supposedly date back to the glory days of the Breton liberation. The Knights of the Dragon in Daggerfall, the Knights of the Flame in Elcaire, the Order of St. Boleyn in Evermore. The list goes on. And what, nowadays, do these knightly orders do to justify their gleaming great swords and shining mail? If we look beyond the banners and pageantry, we find that the chivalric orders fulfill two main purposes in High Rock society. First, They provide an acceptable, noble calling for the excess sons and daughters of the aristocracy. Over time, as trade has made High Rock prosperous, the profession of merchant has become an accepted alternative to feudal lordship for the children of the nobility, but, frankly, not every baron's son has a head for numbers and negotiation. For these spare heirs, there's always a membership available in a local knightly order. Second, the bestowal of a knighthood on a lower-class man or woman is a convenient way to reward outstanding contributions to society, or, for the elevating lord, and confers a measure of that nobility so prized in Breton society. Where the commoner is rewarded for achievements other than in conflict, and this is the case for the majority of knighthoods, the membership in the local knightly order is only nominal, and the new sir or dame is not expected to take up sword and shield. However, if their achievements were in the all-important realm of trade, the new merchant knight is expected to contribute heavily and regularly to the order's financial maintenance. So, if you're visiting Wayrest or Evermore on a mission of diplomacy or trade, don't be surprised if the head of a shipping company is introduced as Sir Doric, or the owner of a string of hostels is called Dame Elizabeth. You're simply meeting one of the fabled Breton knights of High Rock. I hope you've been enjoying these lore readings, and if you have, please do consider subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching.